Bismillah walhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillahi. I wanted to chime back into the whole issue of Dr. Umar Johnson and his statement on being Muslim and what he conceived of as being Muslim. And he characterized it as being alienating, right? As taking on someone else's culture. Firstly, some of us were not necessarily privy to the fact that this is not a new argument. This has been an argument that has come from the Afrocentrists for quite a long time. And some may say, what does that have to do with you? What does that have to do with you? Some may bring in that piece. But one of the things that I wanted to say is that Arturo Chamberg was one of the ones. He was a Puerto Rican intellectual. He was one of the founders of Black Studies. One of the founders of Black Studies here in the U.S. And it was the challenge that was posed to him by a teacher that Africans had no history, that forced him to give some sort of response. And then he dedicated his library. And then from there, from people like John Henry Clark came on the scene and so on and so forth. One of the problems that we have is that a lot of us want to bypass the question of how do we deal with the reconstruction of the peoples of the diaspora. And included in that, in a major way, is Africans in the diaspora. The other indigenous communities, the tribes that were here in the Americas, that's a different discussion. But it's related because the question that Dr. Umar Johnson brings up is very important. Where do you find yourself? Where do you find yourself in relation to Islam? And I'll never forget that our elder Yahya Figueroa, who was the Imam for Alianza Islamica, who came out of the Young Lords and was one of the leaders of the Latino Muslim movement. Although technically I shy away from even, to be honest with you, using the term Latino, because a lot of us know that that's not a real term to identify who we are. We are Native Americans that were colonized, and we happen to mix with other ethnicities and other tribes in the whole process of survival. But that's neither here nor there for the moment. But he said something that's extremely important. He said, you have to make Islam your own. He said, you have to make Islam your own. And that his advice on that has stuck with me for a number of years, because there was a lot of wisdom in that, because that early generation had to work itself out, its situation in relationship to Islam. And so, to be honest, that's the same question that's being asked by those that are Afrocentric. Where do you find yourself? If Ahmed Baba, who was an Imam of Timbuktu, had to ask that question as well. Even though he was a major scholar, he was an Imam in his time period. When he fell into slavery, he had to ask that question. Where do we stand? And he wrote a fatwa saying blackness is not equivalent to slavery. And then he got into the whole process of how do you begin some sort of reform? How do you begin a reform movement to address the plight of people in the Sudan? And in the Sudan in that time was West Africa. And it was an attempt. It wasn't a complete effort, but he began opening up the discussion, right? How is Islam going to relate to the condition of the people in West Africa at this time? And we know that that question still remained, because those same people that he was trying to address with regard to how Islam relates to them and how Islam can bring justice to them, they became the same people that came into the Americas. They came into Brazil. They became the people that came into the Caribbean, and then eventually they came into North America, the Africans of North America. And we know that when they came into the Caribbean and when they came into Brazil, the first few waves, they were scholars of Islam. There's documented evidence on that. That's not speculation by any means. Dr. Umar Johnson, the issue that he raised, we can't sit there and constantly refute when people have an honest qualm. How is it that Islam is going to relate to their situation? That's the question. How is it that Islam, do I have to take on someone else's culture in order for me to be a Muslim? And that's the stuff that we want to evade. It's more work when you have to deal with the people, and they just are not going to take on an identity by taking on their clothing, taking on their language, so on and so forth. That's a legit question. That's a legit question. Even if we make the argument that Arabic is a part of Africa, deeply part of Africa, he may not want to speak Arabic. You know what I'm saying? May want to speak Wolof. Not all Africans that came into the Americas, not all of them, we definitely know that in the Caribbean, not all of them were Muslim. Not all of them were Muslim. So that question of how to reconnect has been the focus. That has been the focus for quite a long time in Afrocentric studies, right? That has been the focus for quite a long time in Afrocentric studies. And part of the problem with the Muslims, some of our people overall in the different tribes, they like to dismiss these questions. Well, when you look at the formation of Pakistan, why did they choose Urdu as a language? Why was that a choice? Why didn't they choose Arabic as a language? That has been a big discussion for years. Why was that the case? Why was it that the Persians decided to maintain their language? What was the call of Ataturk when he tried to make a plea with the Turkish people to abandon the Islamic identity and so on and so forth? Wasn't all of that a search for roots? Especially at a time period where Muslim civilization was not hitting it, so to speak. It was in decline. We know that Kemal Ataturk was an enemy of Islam and so on and so forth, but there are certain things that we cannot evade, and that is, how is it that the deen is speaking to the people? Because the Quran, when this message came, it was speaking to the people. Some traditional orientations are not necessarily going to always speak to the people. Right now, the unfair part that Dr. Omar didn't bring into the question, because maybe due to his understanding or whatever, it is the tremendous contribution that was made by Black Africa to Islam, right? And how it is that if it was not for Muslims in Timbuktu and so on and so forth, Africa would not have had a written history, would not have had written civilization. Timbuktu is what brought that. Africa had hieroglyphics, all these other things, but written history, that came from the Muslims. So with that, people, we have to learn how to relate to the people. Okay, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.